So hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to do a comparison between the OnePlus 10 Pro and the brand new IQoo 9 Pro. Both of these devices are new smartphones that was just announced not that long ago. One of the main things that I definitely appreciated here is the fact that during the launch event of the OnePlus 10 Pro in the comments, I noticed a lot of people talking and referencing the IQoo 9 Pro. So while I have this device on loan from my buddy Juan Carlos, why not put a video real quick to do a comparison between these two flagships from their companies. This is TK and this is the IQoo 9 Pro versus the OnePlus 10 Pro. Like and subscribe and make sure you hit that bell icon so that you're always notified to whenever we have new videos on the channel. So first thing we're going to start off by saying is the OnePlus 10 Pro that I have here is the US version. So this is running at 8 gigabytes of RAM, 128 gigs of internal storage. This is also the same one that we have internationally. Although there are other versions of this that run 256 gigs of internal storage and of course all the way up to 12 gigs of RAM, typically to what we've seen, even 512 gigs of storage. But again, right now in the current market, that's the device that I'm using to compare. As far as what we have here on the IQoo 9 Pro, we have the configuration similar, 8 all the way to 12 gigs of RAM and 256 all the way to 512 gigs of storage. So the configuration on them are pretty comparable. The battery capacity on this one is a 4,700 milliampere as opposed to a 5,000 milliampere charging capacity here. But one thing to keep in mind, although they both support wireless charging, is that the charging capability on this is slightly different. The IQoo comes in with a 120 watt brick, and I'm hoping you guys can see that right. I can't get it. So right there, it's a 120 watt charging brick compatible with this device using a USB-C to C cable connection. They should be able to charge this battery from 0 to 100% in under 20 minutes. Where here we have a 5,000 milliampere battery, but it is supported with a 65 watt charger here in the US or 80 watt charger internationally, as well in China. So capacity, or the charging capacity, although maybe higher here, it definitely charges a lot. Well, it's a lot faster here, so it's kind of technically a much faster configuration here on the IQoo. Lastly here, before we turn over the devices on the other side, we'll notice here that we have two 50 megapixel sensors, the main and the ultra wide here, and a 16 megapixel telephoto lens. When it comes down to the OnePlus 10 Pro, we have a main 48 megapixel sensor, a 50 megapixel ultra wide, and an 8 megapixel sensor. It's going to be our telephoto lens that we have in here. Although when we flip it to the front facing part of the display here, we'll notice that we have a 32 megapixel camera here on the OnePlus 10 Pro as opposed to a 16 megapixel camera here. Now, both of them are capable of shooting 1080p on the front facing camera and all the way up to 8K on the main sensor in the back, although the resolution and the frame rate that we have between the different videos on the main sensors here will also change depending on the device that we're taking a look at. When we're talking about the actual displays, one thing that will definitely pop in front of us is they actually kind of look very similar, and that's because this one is a 6.7 inch display to a 6.78 inch display. They're very close, very similar in size. You'll notice it's ever so slightly bigger here on the IQoo. Both of them are supporting curved displays, so there's no flat displays on here, and they both support an LTPO display. Now, although we have an LTPO 2.0 here on the OnePlus 10 Pro, running obviously a new technology of the panel, they're both running OLED panels, and they're both going to give us really good displays. Now both are running a QHD resolution at 120 Hertz, configurable in both of their systems, so you're definitely going to be getting really good representation there. One thing I will say though, it's the peak brightness that we have right now on the OnePlus 10 Pro is up to 1300 nits, and it is up to 1500 nits on the IQoo 9 Pro. But I'll say this much, in the outdoors experience of using both of these devices, they both get bright enough for us to use them. So it's not a capacity of saying this one gets brighter, and just because it's just brighter than that, it's not going to work. So at the end of the day, you're definitely not going to be disappointed in here. And again, 120 frames per second or 120 Hertz with a QHD resolution display. Now when it comes down to the configuration of what we have here, we have FunTouch OS here running on Android 12, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 with 12 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage. This one also allows us to use some internal storage to basically augment the RAM that we have in here. On the OnePlus 10 Pro, similar thing, 8 Gen 1, 12 gigs of RAM, 8 gigs of RAM with the ability of expanding storage, as well as Android 12 running here. Now this one also has 128 gigs of internal storage, and this is running Oxygen OS as opposed to FunTouch OS. But again, both of them are based on Android 12. Gesture support, Google Feed present on the left, and the ability of having an app drawer if you want to or if you don't. And the refresh rate is definitely very nice and very configurable. Both of them offer us a plethora of customization options to be able to go into the settings and of course customize different options. And they both support an overclocked or more of a beast mode experience. On the IQoo, it's called Monster Mode, and on the OnePlus 10 Pro, it's just High Performance Mode. So technically, both of these devices out of the box, without those modes turned on, are actually running on a throttled version. Now, to be able to get to these configurations, all you have to do is go into the battery section on both of these devices, although under the OnePlus, you do need to go into the advanced section, and you'll notice there's different profiles for the system. Monster Mode is going to be basically the best or highest performance option that we have in here, so let's go ahead and bring that up. And of course, here on the OnePlus, if you turn that on, you'll be running on the full potential. One thing to mention, it will drain battery a little bit faster, and that's expected as you're going to be running it at full potential. So for that, since we're talking about performance and everything, we'll notice that under the Geekbench configuration, we'll notice that they're technically both clocked in at about the same frequency. They're both using the same processor, obviously different models, both running Android 12. So let's go ahead and jump in real quick into history. 1223 to 1238, and kind of like a reverse, a 3745 to 3191 on the OnePlus 10 Pro. Both of them are, again, running prospectively their own version of their software, and of course, if you turn on the performance mode, you are going to be able to get the best performance out of these devices. One thing as far as the launcher that's very similar, if we swipe down from the right side or swipe down from the left side here, we get access to the notification panel. But if I swipe down in the middle, I get access to the universal search option in here. In here, I can configure it to be basically just the swipe down from that. But if I swipe down from the top right, I get access to the OnePlus shelf, and that's also one of the new customizations they have. If I swipe down from the left, it gets us access there. And we also have the new step counter option that we have in here. Okay, so let's go ahead and start talking cameras, and obviously since this is a big part of both of these devices, as I mentioned, a dual 50 megapixel camera sensors on here. It's going to be the main and the primary and the ultra wide, and here we have a 48 and a 50. So similar numbers, but not exactly the same technology, and we're definitely going to do a comparison. I took both of these devices with me to the Huntington Library not that long ago, and I'm going to go ahead and share with you guys some images that I took with both devices so we can see kind of a comparison of how they look like, as well as we're going to go ahead and do a video comparison with front-facing and back-facing sensor using this device. Both of them support a night mode, a portrait mode, photography, video. One thing I will say though, although they both support 8K and 4K out of the main sensors on the back, there is a slight difference in configuration. So although we have 4K in here, you'll notice one thing is that we actually have 4K 120 frames per second on the OnePlus 10 Pro. Although on the IQoo 9 Pro, we only go up to 4K 60 frames per second when it comes to 4K. So we have 24, 30, and 60. Here we have 30, 60, and 120. As far as 8K, we're pretty much capped to basically at 30 frames per second. So if I switch over here, we'll go ahead and switch over to 8K, 24 frames per second, I think is actually the best that we're able to shoot here. So 24 on 8K, 30 at 8K, and of course all the different options that we get in there. Photo mode, and under more, you'll notice here that we have a few additional modes in there. So high resolution, which is also something that we have in here. Pro mode, tuning by Hasselblad, slow motion, time lapse, long exposure, tilt shift. This one also includes 150 degree wide angle shots, as well as the fisheye mode. So this is something that we probably have seen before on the videos in my video that I covered the OnePlus. So definitely a unique experience. Here we have dual view, time lapse, high resolution, pro mode, pro sport mode, of course slow motion, and panorama. But let's not waste any time. Let me share with you guys a quick sample of the front-facing and back-facing sensors on this video examples on both the IQoo as well as the OnePlus. So we're going to start off with the front-facing camera here. 1080p is going to be the best resolution we can get on the OnePlus 10 Pro. Now, we do have technically a higher megapixel sensor here. This is a 32 megapixel sensor over the 16 we had before, and as well as by comparison to what we get on the IQoo. So the biggest difference here is how well does it actually look? Is it better? Is the higher sensor providing us better images? Or is 1080p not just good enough? And obviously we'll have to compare it to what we have on the IQoo. So let me go ahead and switch over to the main sensor on the back, and of course start shooting some 4K 60 frames per second, since that technically is the best, I feel like, shareable content, but we can also go all the way up to 8K with the main sensor here, the 48 megapixel sensor. Using the main sensor on the brand new the OnePlus 10 Pro here is something of an interesting approach here. We have 4K, we have 4K 30, 4K 60, 4K 120. That's also something that not a lot of companies are putting into their smartphones. We don't even find that technically even on Oppo devices. So 8K is also going to be the maximum resolution, although capped to the main sensor. And as far as ultra wide right now, we have 4K 30 frames per second, and of course we have a telephoto. But when we're using 4K, unfortunately it's using digital zoom, not actual telephoto, since that's only an 8 megapixel sensor that we have in there. Starting with the front-facing sensor here on the IQoo 9 Pro, 1080p, 30 frames per second, surprisingly, is also the maximum we can get. Now, it's a 16 megapixel sensor, not a 32, so this may actually be a good experience to show what a 32 megapixel sensor can provide us and what a 16 megapixel sensor can provide us at 1080p resolution. Now, on the main sensors on the back, we definitely get much more, I would say, options and different resolution, as again 8K 30 frames per second is the maximum, but we also have 4K 60 frames per second. So again, a lot of things we can do. Let's go ahead and switch over on the main sensors on the back with the IQoo 9 Pro. Now, one thing the IQoo 9 Pro definitely has more of a benefit here is the fact that we actually have more flexibility when we're talking about 4K 60. I can actually go into the ultra wide to the main sensor and of course be able to use it even with the technically the telephoto function here, as it's technically cropping in. But 4K 60 is actually very flexible, as well as 8K that we also have here. 4K 120 though is not present here, which I feel like is a nice little plus for the OnePlus. And I also think that they can technically add on the OnePlus side, they can technically add the 4K 60 frames per second. It's a 50 megapixel sensor on the ultra wide over there, where it's a 48 on the main sensor, although the main sensor gets the 4K 60. So it could just be something that we can have later on, as we've seen with earlier generations. But this should be a good example again of video, and of course here we're using the ultra wide to shoot this 4K 60 frames per second with a little bit of wind around me. Now, as you saw there, the audio and video definitely sound great, but one thing to keep in mind is, depending on the device that you decide to go with, you're definitely going to get slightly different experiences. The 4K 120 here is definitely very unique and really good when it comes down to slow motion, as I'm sharing with you guys this clip right now. And of course here, the ability of shooting 8K 30 frames per second is a little bit of an advantage over the 8K 24 frames per second. So without wasting any more time, let's go ahead and talk about the speaker experience that we get on both of these devices, since they both support stereo speakers, but let's see which one sounds better at 100% volume. So here it is, 100% volume here on both the OnePlus 10 Pro and the IQoo. We're playing our favorite song. This is Alex Scrindo Jumbo by NCS Release, and we're going to basically see which one plays it louder. So we'll go ahead and start off with the IQoo 9 Pro.
Jack it up.
Definitely sounds really good. Let's go ahead and switch on to the OnePlus 10 Pro.
Jack it up.
So at least to my ears, right out of the box, it sounds like the OnePlus 10 Pro is definitely louder. Both of them don't have any tinging, they don't blow out the audio too much when we're playing them at a high level. So definitely they're both going to sound good, both of them supporting stereo speakers, and both of them supporting similar stereo speakers experience. And what I mean is the bottom firing speaker, the louder one, is giving us a sound to the side, and the top earpiece is mirroring the experience for the sound. So you're definitely going to be getting that type of experience here. One thing to mention though, both don't include a headphone jack. The IQoo does include an adapter in the box, the OnePlus does not, but they both are able to support high frequency or high fidelity audio in here if you're choosing to use them and use their perspective DAC, so definitely very nice. Although when it comes down to audio performance, if I'm not mistaken, the IQoo does support 32-bit 384 kilohertz as far as audio processing, as opposed to what we get here is a 24-192. Both of them are considered to be high quality audio, but just keep in mind that the processing that we get in here. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we're starting to talk about actual configuration and performance, again, on paper, they both perform very similarly, so there's not really a big difference there. Both of them have beautiful displays. Now, as you can see there, both displays look absolutely fantastic when it comes down to actually playing videos back. Both of them are featuring LTPO. Again, as I mentioned, the one on the difference between the two is second generation on the OnePlus 10 Pro as opposed to first generation here. But overall, when you're putting them side by side, you really can't tell the difference. They look absolutely the same, very nice. And of course, we'll definitely support, when it comes to audio performance, they're definitely going to sound very nice and loud for either both the OnePlus 10 Pro or the IQoo 10 Pro. One of the biggest differences that we have between both of these devices is the technology that they're using for their fingerprint sensor. And what I'm talking about here essentially is the radius or the actual size of the fingerprint sensor that we have in here. This is actually one of the largest ones that you can find on the technology. It's Qualcomm's newest fingerprint sensor. And what I mean is, this is literally how fast I barely have to touch it. I'm barely like I'm barely touching it. Like seriously, like I could put it in here. It just unlocks. And one of the craziest part about this thing is how fast I'm able to actually register a fingerprint. So we already have a couple of fingerprints registers. Let's go ahead and unlock this part. So we're going to go ahead and add a fingerprint. I'm going to say start. So 1, 2, that's it. It's done. That's how quickly it was to add a fingerprint here on the IQoo 9 Pro. Now, I'm not saying that we couldn't do that pretty fast in here, but one of the things I definitely appreciate here is the fact that it is actually pretty technically very fast. It's just, the IQoo just is super, super fast. The one thing I also like about both of these devices is that they both offer us shortcuts. So if I press and hold on here and I actually press longer, I'm actually able to run separate shortcuts directly from the OnePlus UI system. And we have something very similar here on the IQoo 9 Pro. The only difference is because the actual the area of the fingerprint sensor is so much bigger here, the shortcuts are actually their own fingerprint. So if I press and hold on here, it opens up YouTube directly as an application. And if I want to be able to do it for Facebook, press and hold, it unlocks using the fingerprint sensor. So I feel like it's a little bit faster when it comes down to shortcuts, although if I really want it again, it does the very similar thing here. It just, you have to kind of give it the little extra, it's a little bit longer because you have to wait for it to unlock and wait for it to bring up the shortcuts. Here, the shortcuts are pre-configured and I can actually just unlock with them directly. I don't have Facebook set up on this yet, but you understand what I mean. Definitely very nice and very easy to customize. And you are able to change the size of the area of measurement when it comes down to the fingerprint sensor. It's directly into the settings when you jump into the fingerprint sensor. Let's go ahead and go back here. And under the fingerprint section here, under the animation style, you're able to customize it and again go from all the way very large to a very small experience. If you do add the shortcuts, this will actually obviously be added as to the side of it. And that's one of the things you can do under basically unlock pattern. You can just go quick actions, and you can add different applications, and you can just unlock by pressing that little button that you have in there. It's very nice and very simple. Now, when it comes down to the gaming experience on both of these devices, we're definitely running very similarly, fast RAM, fast storage. We're also running the 8 Gen 1 as the processor. And both of them offer us somewhat of a throttled experience. And what I mean by this, they're really more focusing about giving us a more consistent gaming experience over allowing the 8 Gen 1 to overheat or even have any kind of concerns when it comes down to gaming for an extended amount of time. What I will say though, both of them play very well. They definitely do get a chance to get warm. This is something, the 8 Gen 1 is unfortunately one of the things we have to find better ways to manage the 8 Gen 1. But neither one of them gets uncomfortably hot unless you're trying to push the system. And you're able to play them with obviously maximum settings and so on. As I'm showing you guys right now, gaming is not going to be a problem on either one of these devices. It's definitely going to be a pleasure. Now let's start talking about the camera experiences when it comes down to photography. I shared with you guys a couple of clips as far as audio and video from the front-facing camera and the back-facing camera. Both of them are capped to 1080p on the front-facing camera. There's not much we can do there. On the back, they have very similar experiences, except we have 4K 120, which is a unique mode that we get to OnePlus devices, and the 8K is at 30 frames per second on the IQoo as opposed to an 8K 24. Although I feel like this is where it kind of starts taking in effect the sensors that we're using. The primary sensor on the OnePlus 10 Pro is, as you know, a 48 megapixel sensor, a Sony sensor, and of course when we're going over to the IQoo, we're up to a 50 megapixel sensor. So let's start taking some pictures or taking a look at some of these pictures that I'm sharing with you guys. I'm going to start off with a nice little basically a gallery of images, and of course a video that I took with the IQoo directly from the Huntington Library here in Pasadena. And as you can see, definitely the colors are rich, the images are vibrant, the video looks absolutely fantastic, and that pan shot that we're doing right now is at 8K, so you're definitely getting the benefit of the full readout on the sensor and enjoying full quality of what we're able to do here. Now during that day, it wasn't a super bright day, but it was a nice sunny day, not too cloudy. So we had an opportunity to see some really vibrant colors kicking in there. Switching it over to the OnePlus 10 Pro, again, very similar experiences, same environment. And of course, we're using the primary sensor, the ultra wide, and of course, recording an 8K clip there as far as the pan shot that I did with the IQoo as well. One of the biggest things that I wanted to say is I initially wasn't planning on putting these two devices head to head. I had them with me at the same time. I'm borrowing the IQoo from my buddy, and of course the OnePlus 10 Pro is in for review. So the overall experience there was just a pure coincidence. But I was very surprised to see some of the images that were coming out there. They're both very nice, very vibrant. I like the colors on both of these devices. I think the Hasselblad, second generation Hasselblad cameras are definitely very nice. And what we see there with the IQoo is that definitely it's a very strong performer. Definitely punching above the price tag that it's actually coming in at. Now, when it comes down to the overall experience and where we kind of summarize everything and start talking about which one is the best device for you, unfortunately, it's going to come down to always kind of situation where it's availability in the market that you're in. If you live in a market where the IQoo is available, I feel like the OnePlus 10 Pro and the IQoo 9 Pro are very comparable and are very close in the experience. Now, technically, both are part of the BBK family. They're both basically subsidiary companies of the BBK family, since this one is basically under OnePlus, where it comes in under the Oppo branch, and of course, the IQoo comes in under the Vivo. But When it comes down to camera experience and camera photography and overall science, I feel like IQoo has definitely taken it a step further, and they've been known for that. And that's what Vivo's always been doing. When I had a chance to play with the X70 Pro Plus, I had a very strong experience there, and I was a very big fan of their technology and what they offer us. There is, again, a very similar experience here with the IQoo 9 Pro. So if you live in the market where you have access to both of them, and you really want to be focusing more on basically a photography type of experience, I feel like the IQoo definitely fits in much better in there. The fingerprint sensor experience is definitely more on the IQoo side. It's a much more newer, bigger, larger fingerprint sensor that literally you barely have to touch the display for it to unlock, and it works consistently every single time. When it comes down to camera experience, when I kind of going back a step there, I will say that 4K 120 is definitely a very good and unique experience to have on a smartphone that we don't have right now on the IQoo. And I don't know if this is something that they can add later on. 4K 60 is also something that I enjoy recording on both of these devices. So for me right now, if I had to pick between one of these two, I technically would go with something that works more in the US market, mostly because that's what's available for me, and all of the 5G bands and so on my carrier, at least T-Mobile, are supported. But if you're in the market where you have access to both of them, I would love to hear your option, or at least your recommendation. Would you go with the IQoo 9 Pro, or would you go with the OnePlus 10 Pro as your next smartphone? Thank you very much for the support. Thanks very much to Juan Carlos for allowing me to borrow his IQoo 9 Pro. And of course, thank you to OnePlus for allowing me to check out the OnePlus 10 Pro. I'll see you in the next one.